¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días. Nos encontramos en una sesión más de nuestro Seminario Internacional de Liderazgo, Innovación Educativa y Literacidad. El día de hoy estamos muy contentos con esta presentación colectiva de dos personajes muy distinguidos de universidades de otros países que nos van a ilustrar acerca de las literacidades de jóvenes y hombres del campo a manera de un diálogo. Voy a presentar en primer término al doctor Michael Corbett, quien es profesor de educación en la Universidad de Acadia, Canadá. Él ha estudiado la toma de decisiones educativas de jóvenes en contextos rurales referentes a las literacidades, movilidades y educación. Si bien el trabajo del doctor Corbett se centra principalmente en Canadá, también ha trabajado a nivel internacional y se ha desempeñado como profesor de educación rural y regional en la Universidad de Tasmania de 2015 a 2018. Bienvenido, doctor Michael. Ahora voy a presentar al doctor Stig-Börje Asplund, quien es profesor asociado del Departamento de Estudios Educativos de la Universidad de Karlstad en Suecia. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen la interacción en el aula y los acercamientos metodológicos de historias de vida con un enfoque especial en los procesos de construcción de identidad y en las prácticas de lectura dentro y fuera de la escuela de los hombres de clase trabajadora rural. Uno de sus nuevos proyectos, financiado por Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, se centrará en los hombres de clase trabajadora rural sueca y sus prácticas locales de lectura a lo largo de la vida personal y de las generaciones. Esto es muy importante para nosotros. Así que les damos la bienvenida a ambos y bueno, adelante tiene la palabra. Creo que empezamos con el doctor Corbett. Bienvenidos.
Thank you. Shall we begin? Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear
Yes,
the
please.
translation because of my screen sharing. I don't think I can get both happening at the same time. So thank you very much. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with you and to collaborate with my colleague Stig-Börje Asplund from Sweden around a common interest that we have in this triangle that you see in the screen. And the triangle is three terms that in some ways represent terms of exclusion. Rurality is a term often put in contrast with modernity, with urbanization, with schooling itself. Literacy is a term that's very often used to distinguish or define people within populations in terms of their levels of sophistication, their connections to modernity. And of course, masculinity, the third leg of the stool, is another term that in recent discourse in education has become very much, in a sense, a space of deficit, particularly when you combine rural and masculine and literacy together. So we'll be speaking to this kind of space in between. The way we're going to proceed is each of us, Stig-Börje and myself, will introduce ourselves, talking a bit about some of the work that we've done around rural education, rural literacy, and boys and men's literacies. And then we're going to each address three questions that we will sort of hope not too artificially pose to one another and speak to. And then following our discussion, our own dialogue, we will open the floor to the audience to engage with us. So hopefully we'll be able to make this happen fairly quickly, and we won't go on for too long. It's always a problem with academics. We say too much. My introduction to begin with. I began as a school teacher in a northern Indigenous community in Canada in the early 1980s. And from there worked in small rural coastal communities. And I was a public school teacher for about 20 years in these communities. And in this experience, I became interested in the mismatch between what schools were trying to achieve in these communities and the way that the communities themselves seem to operate, and particularly the way their economies seem to operate. And I began to look at issues in the early 1990s. As a sociologist. I had a master's degree, and I was hired by my employer to try to understand why so many people were dropping out of school before the completion of high school, which is grade 12 in the Canadian context. And that study that I did in the early 1990s kind of showed me that people weren't so much dropping out of school as that they were dropping into a community-based economy, and particularly young men who had opportunities to work in the fishery were economically very often better off than their teachers. The fishery was booming in the 1970s and 1980s and into the 1990s. And education was, in a sense, not considered particularly important for young men at that time. So I became interested in trying to understand that. And I guess in a way it was a teacher trying to understand why the boys in his class were so disengaged. And from there, I went on to do a dissertation, a doctoral dissertation in the late 1990s that interrogated this problem as well. And I came to the book I wrote that came out of the dissertation is called Learning to Leave. And in that study, I was interested in, or I became interested in the way that education was seen as important for mobility, outward mobility from the rural community, but not so much important for those who wanted to remain within the community. So I did an analysis of 35 years of graduating classes in this small elementary school in a coastal community where I taught, and arrived at the probably not surprising conclusion that formal education was not particularly important to those who remained in the rural place. But as a result of that study, I became quite interested in the way that language and reading were understood and positioned by men. And I'm just going to share really quickly some quotes from various studies that I've done over the years. One particular study that I did focused on a gentleman who came to me in the 1990s when I was a teacher, and he had been a member of, he'd taken part, he was a participant in the OECD's survey of adult literacy in the 90s. And he was very concerned because he received feedback from that study, the test he took as a result of that. And they told this man that he was illiterate. And I went to visit him in his home. He spoke to me about this. And I looked around the home and there were books everywhere. There was literate material all over the place. So I said, "You obviously read a fair bit." And he said, "Oh yeah, this is just fishing stuff. It's not like my wife reads books, but I can't read." And when we began to speak, of course, we realized that he wasn't illiterate. The literacies that he possessed and used in his daily life were not the forms of literacy that were privileged and measured on those tests of literacy. A couple of more quotes from another fisherman. "The teachers hated fishing. They wouldn't even let us draw boats." So this illustrates the gulf between the school as a kind of space that presented education and learning and thinking in certain ways, and the community as a place to be forgotten if you're going to be, you're going to carry on with your education. The disconnection. Another one, "I got to high school and it was the same as elementary school. We sat there reading, writing, and listening. I wanted to do something. So masculinity was defined by these men as an active process of both economic engagement, but being physically active, being embodied, as opposed to the schooled world, which was perceived as a feminine environment and one that was essentially inactive. I could never see the job they wanted me to do in school. I love this quote because this gentleman was a small boat fisherman, and he sort of said, you know, I hung on in school until grade 6 or 7, but I never figured out what the hell they wanted me to do. They seemed to want something from me, but I never knew what it was. And he also talked about how he had worked all across Canada in various kinds of industrial jobs, including fishing, and never had any problem translating his skills into money or into the work world. This is kind of a funny one. A quote from a fisherman. I was on a fishing boat one day, fishing lobster with this guy, and he said, you know, I always said when education came in, common sense went out. So again, the juxtaposition of the knowledge forms that are important to men in the community and the world of school. Another one I love, I'm like a seagull. I can read the weather, I can read the water, I know where the fish are. So the literacies that this man possessed, in fact, it was the same guy in the first quote who was considered illiterate. You know, this also speaks, I think, to the connection between these men and this place and space, and the way that reading is not just, as Paulo Freire says, not just reading the word, it's also reading the world. I got my degree at the University of the Bay of Fundy. You know, I learned how to know what I know through fishing, and it's a very complex education that I've received. And finally, I was doing this work around Y2K. Do you remember that? The computer bug was going to come and we would all be in the dark and the world would come to an end because the computers wouldn't be able to flip over to 2000. Maybe some younger people in this room don't remember that. But this guy says, I don't care. The computer world can fall apart completely. We'll be perfectly fine. So from there, I moved on to some later studies where I was looking at literacy, not just as a singularity, as it's presented in those literacy tests and in the world of education, where literacy is generally considered and treated as a set of technical skills. And I became very interested in rural music folk traditions. I've written about that. I did theater as a teacher with a school teacher with children in coastal communities using local vernacular. I became very interested also in the way that the colonial language of English has, as it is here today, we're all you're having to listen to me in English. I apologize for not being able to speak Spanish. Or Norwegian with Stig-Börje, but I've become interested in the way that the English language itself has become a kind of force in the world. The idea of rural literacies is also something that's come on my radar as a literacy researcher. I'll speak a bit about that a little later. And finally, in a book I wrote with colleagues in 2016, we began thinking about new literacies, film and video, and the way that literacy isn't simply a question of text. And I was interested in how to combine community storytelling and oral language with these new technologies. And that's a little bit of an introduction to some of the work that I've done and how I'm thinking about literacy and men and boys. So I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Mike, for this. Well, me too. I also have a background as a teacher, and my background is as an upper secondary school teacher in Sweden, in a rural place as well. So, and if you don't know where Sweden is, it's up in the north in Europe, very high up, and I think most of the people connect Sweden with winter and snow and stuff like that. And it's also true, but now today we have a splendid sunny weather and summer here, so it's good to be Swede these days. Well, I have taught many boys in especially vet programs in Sweden, and this also made me get interested in their literacy practices, because I saw another picture than we have met in media and in research. I saw students that were actually interested in reading and discussing texts. Not everybody, but I saw some nuances of this. So I thought this was really interesting. And between 2005 and 2010, I wrote my PhD dissertation while still working as an upper secondary school teacher. So 50-50 there in the academy and still as a teacher. And I studied vocational boys' literature discussions from a conversation analytic approach. I videotaped all the conversations in the classroom when they talked about books they have read, and a specific focus on how reader identities were constructed in these literature discussions. So much about focus on the here and now in the interaction when they're talking about books they have read in the teaching in the subject of Swedish. And of course, there were a lot of masculinity in this. Also, I had focus on class issues because they were attending a vocational program. And also in the end of my studies, I saw that place did matter as well, also in these discussions. So I could see how they also constructed the rural place as a place when they were talking about what they have read during the lessons. And that made me also curious to look into this well further. So I think we can turn to the next page or slide. So the former one, the one with the, yeah, great. So I left upper secondary school in 2014 for the university, and I have stayed there since. And I have deepened my interest in specifically rural males' place-based reading practices, and studied that over time. And mainly now I have been approaching rural boys and men's relationship with reading from a narrative perspective. So quite different from the conversation analytic perspective when you're focusing on the interaction, and now more focus on the narratives and focus on their perspectives on reading. And to be more specific, I have approached these narratives from a life history approach. So I have been a project leader for a couple of projects, and the common theme in these projects and studies has really been to explore these issues from boys and men's perspectives through narratives, and to study the narrative experiences of reading from the standpoint of the present. So mainly one could say I have studied literacy and reading practices as it has been lived by these boys and men in rural places. And these stories or narratives are also full of strong positioning and identity performances. And it's also a way to, and a will for me, to get behind stories such as I can't read, I never read, and to get access to other stories such as I read a lot of Western books, for example, or audiobooks are fantastic. So this is also a way to connect to what Michael said. This is a way to get access to the hidden or vernacular reading practices that they are engaged in, actually. And the aim of these studies and projects has really been to gain knowledge about how a group of people who are often described as poor readers, how they use texts and how they use reading in their lives and in their identity formations. And just recently, if we turn to the next slide, Mike, I got some good news in late November for a project funded by this Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, as you told us earlier in the presentation, one of the big Swedish funders. So that was good news. And so this will be a project that will start in this autumn, and it will run for 3 years ahead. And it will be, as you can see, local reading practices of working class males from rural woodlands in Sweden. And I will, together with some colleagues, conduct life history interviews with 3 generations of men in the same family, in at least 5 families, to explore the local reading practices. So across generations and also over time. And just to mention, just a couple of days before I submitted the application, Mike actually read the application and gave me some great feedback to it. So it was successful feedback as well. So looking forward to this project. Thank you. So that's my short introduction. Yeah. So maybe we should go over to our discussion now, Mike. And we have, as Mike told you, we have a couple of questions that we thought we should highlight and then discuss. And the first question is really, as Mike has told you, and Mike, you have obviously a long experience of conducting or doing research in the field of rural studies, but also a big interest and a long interest in literacy. And if you put them together, you have rural as a concept and you have literacy as a concept. Well, obviously you have rural literacies if you put them together. And the question I would like to ask you now is, of course, what about this with place and literacy, and what are rural literacies?
Well, thank you, Stig-Börje. Well, I didn't expect that question at all. Yeah, I wanted to address this subfield of rural literacies because beginning in the mid-2000s, scholars Kim Donauer, Charlotte Haug, and Eileen Schell wrote a book, and it's entitled Rural Literacies. And the pieces that you're seeing on the screen now are books that represent influences on the original kind of rural literacy idea. Deborah Brandt is a literacy researcher from the United States who's looked at literacy in life. Jacqueline Edmondson, who did Prairie Town, looks at literacy in rural communities in relation to sustainability. And David Barton and Mary Hamilton are good British proponents of the new literacy studies. And the very idea of looking at literacy as a social practice or a set of social practices, as opposed to a set of technical skills. And all of the implications, I think, connected to that shift in ways of looking at literacy are important. So I think maybe the first, get this thing working here, whoops. To take a couple of definitions. First of all, literacies, you'll notice that it's in plural rather than in the singular. And that signifies, I think, back to the last slide, that literacy is connected to life. Literacy is connected to embodied social practices in a place. And those of us who are interested in rural literacies, we're interested in examining how this multiple idea of literacies would actually fit into multiple spaces, including spaces that are defined as rural. So from Kim Donauer and her colleagues, their initial definition is rural literacies refer to particular kinds of skills needed to achieve goals of sustaining life in rural areas. So they were very interested in literacy as a way of thinking about how it is that individuals and communities can, again, following Freire, read the world and develop literate practices that don't do what I found people doing, leaving their communities, but actually living within them and developing them and connecting literacy practices in schools, particularly with the lives that ordinary people lived. The second definition is from a piece by Bill Green within a book that he and I edited, the bottom one, Rethinking Rural Literacies. And we took the idea of rural literacies into what we call a transnational context. We were interested in seeing how this idea of rurality and literacy, how they fit together in the work that scholars were doing in different parts of the world, a very limited scope of the world. Obviously, we have a couple of pieces from North America. There are a couple of European pieces. And there are some pieces from Australia and do we have a New Zealand? No, I think just Australia. So transnational in the sense of the spaces where this field of rural literacy has actually taken hold and grown and moved. The influences behind this are again coming from the New Literacy Studies, which was as I expect some of you, or maybe all of you know, was a movement began in Britain and moved out into to North America and into Australia fairly quickly. Again, looking at how can we understand literacy as social practice and connected to life situations. And so Mary Barton and David Barton and Mary Hamilton went into various communities and looked at, very much like Stig-Börje's work, how people are literate rather than how much literacy they have. A different way of measuring and thinking about the connections between practice and literacy. The sociology of literacy, of course, has always been interested in the relationship between literacy and politics, social formations, government, schooling, and the way that literacy itself is a tool of power within social space. Rural studies is also an important influence of the work that we've done in rural literacies. The rural studies literature looks at rural communities, and in a way, rural studies is a field that spends a lot of time trying to figure out whether it should even exist. What is rural? The whole definition of rurality is a central problem in rural studies. And so we take that up as well, particularly in the book that Bill and I wrote. What constitutes rurality? How can it be thought about in a broader frame than just the agricultural imagery that typically gets associated with it? Critical pedagogy, of course, attempts to use the insights of critical theory, critical sociology, and move educational studies and educational practice, teacher training, toward a more sociological and critical framework to look at schooling as something that doesn't just happens to the kind of Cartesian individual who's isolated and assimilates knowledge, but to look at people as members of community and to think about education in relation to those communities and those histories. Mobility studies, this is a particular interest of mine. I'm very interested in the relationship between rural schooling and the movement of populations out of rural communities, typically into urban spaces. And we can perhaps talk a bit more about that. But a number of the studies in rural literacy look at this relationship between what I call learning and leaving. Cultural geography, of course, has been an important influence for us as well. Many of us working in this field have found that geographers have much more to say about the problems we're interested in than folks working within education. And the geographers are very attuned, I guess, to the next point, to thinking about and understanding space, and particularly notions of space and place as more than just containers for that action happens within, but as areas that are produced through linguistic and material activities in the world. And finally, we're influenced by and want to promote connections between education and ecology, and the ideas of sustainability, but also the notion of bioregions. And my colleague Bill Green is very much interested in thinking not about so much about spatial categories of rural and urban, as much as thinking about bioregions and how the urban and rural areas within those spaces are codependent and how they relate to one another. So a regional analysis, and this again comes very much from cultural geography. Very few contemporary geographies think about rural and urban, well, very much at all as a binary category. So some of the things that we, and the people on the right here are Kim Donauer and Charlotte Hogg and Eileen Schell, and my colleague Bill Green. We're kind of the principal people who've created this field, or the people that the women, of course, created the field. Bill and I, as men, we follow along, and this is what we've been doing. So the key points, I think, in rural literacy is that literacy is unavoidably political. We can't think about literacy as a kind of neutral set of technical skills, of a sort of, we're hearing a lot in North America about the science of reading, which seems to decontextualize the act of learning to read and focusing very much on phonetic instruction and the micro bits, I suppose, of reading, as opposed to reading as a practice that occurs within the political space of communities and relationships, which are not neutral. What we read and how we read are very much political phenomena. Secondly, we're very interested in the studies that we've done, and literacy is a mutable and mobile phenomenon. Literacy changes with the technologies that we use to communicate with one another and the symbolic activities. But literacy also changes from place to place, and it in itself is a mobile thing, a mobile phenomenon. We're also, in this work that we do, very interested in highlighting multiple ruralities and multiple literacies, thinking about, moving away from the binaries and the singularities toward thinking about how ruralities connect with one another and how they are multiple as opposed to singular. So in my own country, for example, rural can mean anything from a very isolated indigenous community in the Arctic to a massive farm on the Western prairies, where two people are operating a massive grain operation, to a coastal village like the one I'm looking out right now at the Atlantic Ocean. And this morning I was watching small lobster fishing boats just right outside of my my venue, to small mining communities, some abandoned, some still functioning. There's a wide variety that we want to pay attention to and to understand through multiple studies in these different forms. So rural literacy is not about figuring out some kind of universal criteria for how to teach people in rural areas how to read. It's not about that at all. It's more about understanding the different ways that literacy as a social phenomena can be connected to those multiple lives and the multiple ways in which that can happen. And how can literacy challenge rural stereotypes? And we're going to talk a little bit later on about deficit discourses in relation to rurality. And I think one of the most important literacy challenges today is to help rural people understand that they are not somehow deficient, and that their places are not somehow deficient. I've just been doing a little bit of work with colleagues on an American novel that won the Pulitzer Prize a couple of weeks ago, which is about an Appalachian kid in the mountains of eastern United States. And it's really all about challenging those rural stereotypes. Also challenging the way that curriculum tends to be written from the perspective and to support urban industrial development. So we call this in our field the metrocentric curriculum, the curriculum that's effectively placeless, that imagines that place doesn't matter. And we're attempting to introduce the notion that literacy is always situated and always translocal, always relational. And finally, the problem of sustainability that I've mentioned before. I won't continue here any further. So that leads us to our second question, which I will pose to Stig-Börje. And the question is, how does rural masculinity signify in relation to literacy in your research? And I want to begin with the deficit discourse in education that's become very prominent around boys and men in relation to schooling, but also in relation to health and problems like addictions, suicide rates, and so forth, which are almost epidemic proportions in the United States, and they've developed a kind of moral panic. And just to start with, let's take the latest OECD PISA results. And here's a quote from page 18. In all countries and economies that participated in PISA 2018, girls significantly outperform boys in reading. Every country surveyed by PISA, this happened by almost 30 score points on average across OECD countries. So here we are. This is, I'm not contesting that it's true, but it definitely presents in the OECD PISA testing is a certain kind of picture of what constitutes literacy and who has it and who doesn't. It measures it. I call it the edumometer. You stick a thermometer in the nation and you pull it out and you get a reading on how much literacy is in there. It is what it is. Some good news from Mexico. You and Mexico are one of the best in the world in terms of a small gender gap in reading performance. Okay, so the picture you're getting, you could say, well, we're doing pretty well here in Mexico. It's all good. Not so good in Canada. We're just slightly under the OECD average of 30 points on their testing. Sweden is slightly over the. So in our countries, we're seeing more of the thermometer reads, more of a gap. And when we look at these reading scores in terms of rural and urban reading gaps, Sweden isn't on this chart for some reason. So I've highlighted Canada and Mexico. And what these, it's a little bit of a wonky thing to read, but the blue triangles, the blue diamonds, show the deficit between boys and girls in reading scores. Excuse me. The triangle is after accounting for socioeconomic status. The little squares, they are the raw deficit in raw scores. So you can see, Portugal, 100. There's a 100-point difference. The only country that even comes close is the United Kingdom. For some reason, it looks pretty much even. But when you account for, when you control for parental income, socioeconomic status, that's the blue diamond. So it gets a little bit better. The gap closes when you account for, in most countries, although it actually doesn't in a couple of countries. So rural places, in some places like Mexico, when you control for socioeconomic status, rural areas actually perform better. But in most of the world, that isn't the case. So this is another form of thermometer analysis of literacy. And generally, these are all deficit analysis. So deficit boys, deficit rural. So Stig-Börje, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Okay, thank you, Mike. Well, this all links back actually to my own research, actually, so which has been the starting point for my interest as well. And the background has been the problem, as Michael has told you now also, that the male's problematic relationship with reading. So as we all know, it has been emphasized in research and the media all over the place always that boys and men read too little and they read poorly. And if they read, they do it in all the wrong ways. And the ones who read the least and the worst are the working class males. So this is in a context also of the gender gap debate, so to speak. So, and also a context of the problematic boys. And as the problem with boys and men is often also framed as the problem of boys and men. I think also this is something that Reeves talks about in his book that he recently published. And you can see this in research, and Paul Willis was one of the first who wrote about this when he talked about the anti-school culture that boys are constructing in school, and others have followed, for example, McIngale and Pascoe's study. And we can also see that there are discussions about masculinities that are at odds with so-called feminine pursuits, such as reading. And when it comes to rural masculinities, they're often described as a social problem in the context, and often described as passive, and as Michael talked about just recently, as unmodern, and also that they are reproducing traditional or hegemonic or orthodox masculine identities, and also gender relations, and a proxy for racism, gender violence, etc. And when they are described in literature, they're also described as hands-on doers. That is, they are often connected to handyman skills and nature mastery and stuff like that, physical strength, misogynistic attitudes, and also emotional restraint. But I think that if we take the next slide, I believe this is the other one. Yes. Next one again. Yes, stay here. This one. I think this is this dominant picture that we are seeing, or this dominant narrative about boys and reading is too simplistic, and it also has some vibes of moral panic with it, and that the focus on gender as the sole factor, together with this discourse that Mike was talking about, that emphasize the values of numbers, statistics, and tests, is and has been misleading in many ways. So there's a need, I think, to pay attention to the multiple masculinities constructed by different groups of males in different contexts, and also to make visible the complex way the social and cultural processes intersect with reading practices, and also pay attention to not only masculinity but also class and gender, of course, place and ethnicity when exploring these issues about literacy. And therefore also to explore the interrelationship between masculinities and rural place in literacy studies. And this all could be a way to broaden and nuance our understanding of rural boys and rural men's relationship with reading, I think. Yes. I think you may have a third question there, Mike.
I'll have to unmute myself. Yeah, that's interesting. That really has me thinking about lots of things. And that Reeve book that you mentioned, I just read a little bit of it. And he's talking about both, you know, there's a lot of data to show that men are really suffering in the United States in terms of suicide rates and education. One of the stats that he draws is actually very kind of frightening in a way. The United States instituted a law in 1972, Title IX, might have heard of, that was designed to create gender equity in the universities and to stimulate more admissions. Women were 12% below men in the American universities in 1972. Today, that has actually flipped, and women are out enrolling. They're over enrolling vis-a-vis men by 15%. Male suicide rates are 4 times as high as female rates. You know, so there's a lot of data. I don't want to discount this data, but at the same time, there's a whole problematic discourse about masculinity that goes on. So you've got conservatives in the United States, in North America. It may be the same in Europe. I'd be interested to know, or in Latin America as well. The conservatives say that men are being destroyed by a female-dominated system. They're being emasculated. Their masculinity is being removed by a whole set of nefarious forces. So men are no longer men. On the other side, on the liberal, more radical side, they're saying there's this thing called toxic masculinity that is the real problem here. So men are being positioned as dangerous. They're more violent. They tend to be much more abusive to one another and to women. They're gun violence. They're doing poorly in school. The whole thing is part of, and the sports culture is part of this as well. So there are these two competing ways to interpret the same quantitative phenomenon, that this is men destroying the society or men being destroyed by the society. And I think it's absolutely fascinating the way this plays out. And who is actually doing what you're doing? Let's drill down and actually look at what's going on in rural communities, which are very often portrayed as the most right-wing, the most conservative parts of any society. And I think this is why we need qualitative rural literacy studies. So we can actually go in and see what's going on by investigating these monsters that get created by large-scale quantitative analysis. You know, the boy is not a monster. The boys are multiple different things. So, you know, what's the range of male readers that you identities that you found in your research, Stig-Börje? How do you speak back to this horrible?
Yeah. Okay, so what I have done, as I told you earlier as well, I have mainly done my research on life history interviews with both boys and men in rural places. And they have lived in the rural woodlands in Sweden, actually. So, and I have been interested in exploring their relationship to reading and to study what they read, how, when, and why they read texts, and how these reading practices intersect with their identity formations. So if we take the next slide, I will present this as two sides on a like a classic vinyl records back in the days. And when it comes to the A side, this is the side that when I confront and start to do interviews with these boys and men, almost everyone in the beginning says to me, "Why should you want to talk to me? I'm not a reader, I don't read. You can go to someone else to talk about literacy and reading." So early on, they are always positioning themselves as non-readers when I talk to them early in the interviews. And also they are talking about negative experiences from reading instruction that they have encountered in school. And they've also often been positioned by the teachers as poor or unwilling readers in the context of the school. And all this basically confirms previous research about rural working class boys and their responses to school and reading. So this is a pattern of what you can call a social and cultural reproduction. And just to give you some quotes to illustrate this, like one of these men, he was 25 when he right away in the beginning of the interview told me that, "Well, I suck when it comes to reading. I just can't handle it. Sitting still and just read. It's a pain in the ass. Yeah, it's something that gets on my nerves, that's for sure. I can't read, you know." And another told me that, "Well, in junior school, I had to go to them special teacher in Swedish because she was so damn convinced that I had some learning disability that she never could prove. And she had these damn texts, and that bastard of a woman just sat there nagging, sharing such shit with me." And another story, I have never read a school book. So that also is in the context of what you should read and not read. So these non-reader identities that they are constructing in these interviews are often constructed in relation to what I call the dominant discourses about reading, what reading is and what it is not, and what the reader is and what the reader is not. And to be a reader, according to these boys and men that I have interviewed, you should read a thick book, and you should read typographic text written on real pages, and it should be a novel that is thick, of course. So that's what they see when they talk about a reader. Yeah, if we take the B side then, the other side, because when you're using narrative approaches, often I go to them several times so we can talk for hours. And of course, then you can see all the stuff, then you can, when you're just measuring how well they read a certain type of text. So the narrative approach actually enables, I think, more nuanced narratives about rural males and reading. And I can see that they read actually a lot, as Michael also told you early on, and they think they don't read, but then when they are talking about it, they actually read a lot. And they also read different kinds of texts and also different difficult texts. So what I can see is the text they read and what their readings are often connected with manual occupations and also embodied activities such as working with or repairing cars or motors or to build and hunt and fish. So these are activities that are related, of course, to the rural place or the woodlands that they are living in and where they are working or go to school. So this is a really a place-based reading practice that they are talking about and describing for me when I talk to them. And just to give you some short examples about this, one of the men, the first interview, he said he doesn't read that much, but then he says that, well, I know when Dad bought the first new Volvo. I think it's quite a Swedish, famous Swedish car, even outside Sweden. I probably read that instruction manual, so I knew every single piece of data on those Volvos by heart. So he told me he read this instruction manual over 100 times, so he knew this car by his heart. And also they read a lot about text so they can solve problems. So a problem-solving reading activity. So the second example, I read to find out something, how I should do something. For example, if a problem occurs, like if I screw and repair, I usually then go to forums and things like that to read about it on the internet then, and see how they have solved the problem, like how to replace a filter or how much torque to tighten certain bolts and so on to get it right. We can take the next slide. So what I can see in my data when I have conducted these interviews is that reading in this way is very much transformed into a socially accepted practice that is very pragmatic and very useful for these boys and men, and also turned into and practiced in a familiar and safe place. So therefore it also is a familiar and safe practice for them. So they read for learning, they read for development, and also read for a future life in this specific rural community, to be a part of it and to handle the what they should handle in this community as a successful man. Another way to put it and to explain it is to use Hilary Yank's concept of redesign. They are redesigning these literacy practices and turn it into something else. And I have written about this together with Ivor Goodson, and we say that this also is a way of culturally reappropriating written culture, or Borges written culture, through the processes of oralizing and manualizing. Maybe I should just close with a short example of what really links back to what you was talking about early on, the man that was surrounded by so many books, Mike, because during one of the interviews, you can turn to the next slide, I also met a man that told me that he wasn't a reader. And then I visited him and conducted several interviews. I think I conducted 4 interviews with him. And as you can see, this is just a small picture of his workshop that he has turned into a library. And he actually had over 10,000 books stored in on his yard, in a house on his yard, in a storehouse. And there was clearly a delicate system of how to place these books in the shelves, the order, about numbers, genres, etc. And also had first he had a private section, but also had a section that he called the library. And this library was actually used by inhabitants, people around him. So they knew that here we have books that we can go and lend. And he also had a system that if you come and take a book, you must leave 2 books for one. So the collection turned bigger all the time. So this is actually in an era of the depopulation of the rural places, and also where they're closing down local libraries in the rural places. So you can see this as an act where he actually constructs and builds a local library as a rural man in a rural place in Sweden. So quite fascinating, I think. And when I talked about this collecting book, it was very much a physical and embodied activity taking place in this rural place. So also connected to what Mike talked about just earlier about this literacy as an embodied practice in a place. And obviously it turned out also that actually he read a lot, but what he read wasn't school books. He read Western books and detective novels published in Sweden in the 50s, 70s, 50s, 60s, and the 70s. And he really enjoyed reading them, and sometimes he read up to one book a day, actually, he told me. So the next and last slide for when talking about this Robert, you can see then that this book collecting and the reading that Robert talks about could be seen as acts through which he actually demonstrates a masculine rural working class habitus, reading these Western novels where you know these male identities about handymans, strong physical men, and tough men and stuff like that. And also he then reproduces the specific rural place in these practices. But at the same time, we also have a man here that preserves a literary cultural heritage when building this local library in this rural place in the woodlands in Sweden. And through these processes, he also actually constructs himself as a rural man who reads a lot of books. So when it comes to this reappropriation, actually he uses this as a strategy to that makes it possible for him to well, first align smoothly with another social field, that is to being close to the what you can call a middle class habitus, but still remain loyal to his rural working class habitus and to the community where he lives. So in order to see the whole picture of these rural males, you must listen to the whole record and not just one side of the records. Thanks. Okay.
And I think that concludes our presentation. I think I really like the way that Stig-Börje's specific research and description of the project fits in with what we were trying to stimulate in the whole rural literacies movement over the last 15 years. I think it's a wonderful example of the kind of qualitative work that can complicate some of these deficit discourses and you know, really speak into what teachers, what schools, what individuals who are institutionally positioned to work with data to figure out how to educate children better and young boys and men. I think these studies are particularly important because the large scale quantitative analysis only gives bad news. So with that, we'll conclude and open to discussion.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentations. I think we have some minutes for opening the floor to anyone who has a question or a comment. In the meantime, I would say that this panoramic that these scholars present to us are very interesting, and we can find some parallelisms with our Mexican rural lives. In Mexico, after the revolution in the 20s, past century, we have this we have, at that time, we have 80% rural people and 20% living in cities, okay? And at that time, after the revolution, the Ministry of Education started a big cross for literacy, trying to make these people from rural areas read the classics, Greek literature. So they had a very bad experience because rural people said, what does it mean to me? Okay, this is not what I need. And I remember that when Börje was mentioning this boy that was able to read a manual for the Volvo machinery, but of course they don't need fiction because they are doers. Okay, so after this big failure on literacy crosses, we started the basis for the rural school in the 50s. And this was a very big and very nice movement that we had in Mexico that opened the opportunity for the CREFAL to be born. And this CREFAL posted a new way to educate in rural areas, educating in a way more integral, and also according to the realities, trying to solve their problems of these specific communities that were very different from place to place. Don't forget that Mexico have a very big variety of regions and climates and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's very different each context. So CREFAL, it was a very successful initiative that made people like Ivan Illich and Paulo Freire come to Mexico to join to these colleagues studying that. But what happened later is that at present we have 20% rural people and 80% living in cities. So we missed some very important things from the rural school, and we are now dealing with all these people in the cities struggling how to improve our literacy. We have a high rate of literacy, 96%. But the problem is that this high literacy rate does not correspond to our habits of reading and writing. And we need to do more research to know about new ways, to explore new ways of doing these local literacies for learning in different ways. So having different results in our approaches to reading. So that's our experience. So I don't know if someone would like to do a comment or question.
Can I just make a short comment, or should you like to what you just said, Patricia?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Just to make the man who told me that he read the Volvo manual, and he doesn't need stories, because what these men actually are doing, they are bathing in stories, but they are taking bath in. They're living in an oral storytelling tradition, so they are hearing stories all over again from parents and from friends and from relatives, but they are taking place in an oral storytelling tradition. So they love listening to stories. And in fact, this man who told me about the Volvo, he works in the woodlands and driving forest machine for 12-16 hours a day. And then he listens to audiobooks. So actually it comes that he listens to 3 or 4 audiobooks a week. So he actually reading more than I was reading when I was interviewing him, because he was listening to the stories at the same time as he was working. So that's another way to see this as well, I think. Many ways to take part of stories.
Mm,
Yeah.
absolutely. Patti Cisneros, ¿quieres tomar la palabra? Adelante, por favor.
No, no tiene micrófono.
Ah, no tiene micrófono. ¿Quiere?
Well, Patti Cisneros is a doctor from our master's program, and she's asking what methodologies you apply to question the statements that rural men doesn't read.
Did that question make sense, Stig-Börje?
I don't know. I thought it was related to what method should be used to
respond to that idea.
Okay. I think what we have talked about
Bias. Bias.
Today, but also that there's a need to do a lot of qualitative research to get behind these numbers and statistics and tests to see other sides of this, to paint another picture and to show another picture of these males. I don't know if I responded to this question, but this is when it comes to methods, I think, because there are obviously other measurements as well as Mike showed you, the PISA, for example. You can see how it differs. So that's one way to put it, but you can talk about different literacies and different reading practices.
So I heard the question slightly differently. I thought she was perhaps asking, how do you get men to talk about this idea that they can't read? How did you get them speaking and responding to that, their initial idea? I was thinking about my son. My son's a young teacher, and I asked him, he says, I don't read. He fishes, he hunts, he's on the internet all the time. He reads all the time, but he defines himself as a non-reader. And I think you hit it quite nicely. He's not a reader of fiction. So I was thinking, how would I get him to complicate his own sense of himself as a reader, which I do actually, but how did you do it with the boys that you talk to?
Okay. I don't know actually, because it just happens in the interviews. So I when we talk for a long time, and I also open up questions about other interests, like do they watch movies? How do they take what they're doing in the leisure time and stuff like that? And then they talk about many different things, and then you can see that actually they are talking about reading as well. But just to get back to what Mike also talked about, I have actually done a study on in a vocational program on boys, where we had focus on their reader identities in the teaching. So the boys were allowed to talk about themselves as readers and what they read. And I also had the opportunity to interview a male relative about their reading practices. And then they took that back into the classroom and talked about it. So this was like a small example of how can we get boys in the classroom to talk about themselves as readers. And then we interviewed them after this intervention study. And actually a lot of them was quite surprised, because when they now saw that actually reading a motor magazine, reading about how I can use the internet to be able to solve problems with my tractor or with my car, or reading about how to be able to communicate with my dog better when I'm hunting. Actually are reading practices that are important to them. So This was a small project, but it showed that it is possible to talk with rural boys, to let them talk about themselves as readers. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That answered my question.
Okay. It took a long time to answer the question, but hopefully we.
No, it's okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, Mike.
I just a quick comment. One of the things I did as a teacher, I used to do this occasionally, is send students home with the assignment to ask their elders, their mothers and fathers and grandparents and aunts and uncles, why do people read? And then I created we created a whole poster display of the answers to this question. And what really struck me about that is usually the answers that came back had very little to do with pleasure. In the rural community where I taught, it was all about getting a job or being able to do something embodied in the world, to understand how to fix my tractor. And I thought it was really sad. I always did, that people aren't saying, I read because it's enjoyable. A few did, but most were very instrumental and pragmatic. And I took that as a kind of indication of the social class position of a lot of the people. They were working class people. So literacy was, to them, reading was a tool like any other that you use to get something in the world. And this notion of passive literacy, where you just sit with a book and read passively, that was seen like in my mother's generation. For a woman to be called a reader was something to be, you're lazy. You don't keep house, you don't work hard. You're somebody who sits around and eats candy and reads books. So you're not really a good working class woman if you do that. You're kind of royalty or something. So yeah, I was just thinking about that relationship between pleasure, instrumental technical notions, and reading. So that's my comment. Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you very much that you talk about that, because we are on research and we were to see how the little kids read, and we were talking about that, about how how we do to kids read, and with pleasure, or always has to be with pleasure. And we saw this thing. I think that this thing that you are saying, that is about some social class, is very important, because we are academics, so we can read, it's our job. But for people that is not their job, they don't have time. So we have to figure it out how to do it, I think. And I was thinking in the same thing, something that I like it is about masculinity and how we have to expand, because here in Mexico, we have a big problem with the violence and the feminicidios, the men killing women. So I think that is important. There are many community feminists that are saying the men are not the problem. No, the problem is the capitalists. The problem is the patriarchy. No, because not only women suffer the patriarchy, but men does too. So I think that is very important what you were saying about to expand the notion of the masculinities. Is certain that we have that problem, but we cannot say that all men are bad or monsters, that you were saying. And I think that is something important that you were saying about these rural literacies, because you are saying we have to expand, the notion of literacy, because if not, many people is thinking that they don't read, they are illiterate and all that. So I think that is very important for our context to understand that. So it's more a comment, but I think that is very important, and I like it very much what you were talking to us. So thank you. And we have a comment from Marisol.
Hi, Professor. I really appreciate your keynote. I really like it. I was thinking about what is happening with my students. We do a research, and it's happened the same. The students and the male and the females, they don't really thinking there are no readings, because when they think in read is when I read a book, or when I do some class activities for the class. But when they use the social media, when use the technology, they think they know read it. So how we can try to change that, and they're start to thinking, I'm a reader. I'm really different, but I'm reader. And try to how to relate in research with my students, in underdegree students. They research about the reggaeton music. The reggaeton music is about no nice songs. The letter is very violent, very difficult. But the students, their founder, the young people and the male people listen the music not for the read, not for the letter. Listen the music for the sound. Even they don't know what is the music say, the singer. So I was thinking, is go the students, they know do a literacy for reading, probably they know go the ability for critical thinking for when they're listen music, and they don't care, they don't put attention about what is the music say. So what do you think? If we practice more literacy for the reading, they can be more aware about what happened around them, about try to stop violence or something? What do you think? I don't know, I'm explaining myself, or I don't know, it's clear.
There's a great deal in what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, we like to think about schools as places where we can kind of put up walls, and the outside world and the literacies and the textual practices and the language outside those walls will not come in, and we can give our children these little books that are completely innocent, and they'll be able to be safe in a sense. I mean, schools really, why do we have schools? We have them to keep children safe, fundamentally. And I think, a lot of our practices within schools attempt to create a fantasy world. But the reality is our children live in the real world. And so they're affected by these very, engaging forms of music that they love to move around to, and they love to, and you're right, they probably aren't paying very careful attention in a lot of cases to the language content of those pieces of music. Now, the question is, how much of that outside material do you bring inside your classroom and you take up with kids? You engage critically with your students with these texts. These are texts. Margaret Meek Spencer, a British literacy theorist, used to talk about the text of the time. Every moment or every era has its forms of communication, and social media, you know, I guess is maybe the text of the time now. Popular music forms are the text of the time. And, you know, in my own view, I think that those texts of the time need to be brought into schools, and they need to be discussed rather than kept outside of school. And, you know, we try to create a space where we imagine they don't exist. I also think, you know, connecting to Stig-Börje's work, that if we really want young people to become interested in what we're doing in literacy education in schools, we can't give them shit that they're not interested in. You know, it has to be engaging, contemporary material. And if we're giving them the old classics or some book that I, as a teacher, read as a child and loved, you know, that may not be the best thing. Finally, I also think you got me thinking about something here that I don't think I'd thought about before, which is that the way we focus in early education on little storybooks, and how do we introduce children to language? It's little storybooks. And I think a lot of children just aren't really drawn to them at all. And I wonder if we're kind of doing a little bit of damage by the limited range of texts that we use to teach children at the very beginning of their reading experience. That's just a thought. I don't know. I'm not an early literacy expert, but I wonder if some of those 5-year-old kids are bored by what we're giving them.
Thank you very much. I don't know, another comment?
Yes, Coco, and then Dr. Cesar. Or Stig, you want to say something? No? Okay, Coco. Coco, and you have to change the channel. Well, we can, Dr. Cesar, and then Coco.
Thank you very much for this presentation, which feels more than a conversation with good remarks, very important remarks. One of the things that probably, as an educator in rural areas and working in Profab, which is one of the institutions Patricia Rosa was saying, mentioned before, I was very interested in what you were saying related with the reading and how to improve reading at schools. But mostly what I found more important working with this population is the gap there is between the interpretation of reality and what the materials of reading in class, which we have to consider in Mexico, which is a very particular environment and nature of rural schools, especially one that we call normal rural schools, were in the part of the revolution, the Mexican Revolution was the ideological part of the process that at that time a politician and a thinker that he was in front of the secretary of education at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, Vasconcelos, and he sent teachers to teach at the rural schools, and they have this idea of missionaries at the countryside. There was a very wide and wild and bold idea. But what had happened at this time was that the community was very tied to the projects of the school. And that was very interesting in the sense of what the people were reading in the schools and related with the practice in the community. So that marked the story of these schools and rural schools in Mexico, which now we have only 19 in the country, and they're having been very stigmatized by politicians and the government and actually killed, unfortunately. But of what I'm thinking, and probably of what Patricia Cisneros was saying related to methodology, it's the possibility to work as a participatory and research, which is very important in the way how students are related, reading with reality, with the world of reality. And I think that probably teachers are more concerned of making reading enjoyable for students, which is very, very important, of course. But at the same time is to make sense with what they're living at this moment. So I just wanted to make this remark.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Just a quick response comment. I've been doing a lot of thinking about urban academics studying rural schools, rural teachers. And so a couple of my doctoral students are looking to work in rural schools, and we're thinking about what methodologies might make sense. And a couple of them are very interested in arts-based and other forms of participatory methodologies that engage participants, students, teachers, parents, and communities in ways of thinking about school practice that don't involve the standard interview or a standard survey, but involve some kind of an engagement with photography in some cases, or an engagement with making art in some way. And I think that might be, an interesting way to kind of think through the relationship between the person doing the research and the people being researched in a way that's a little bit, the participants aren't just answering your questions, they're actually creating something with you in a more authentic way. And maybe that does go to Patricia's question about methodologies as well. I think we need to get more innovative methodologically across the field of education generally, but particularly when we're studying the other. I hate to say that, but how do we develop methodologies that bridge the space between us as researchers and participants a bit better than we've done historically? Stig-Börje, do you have any comments on that? Oh, sorry.
And Michael, and especially the question about who are we? It's because mostly of what we're trying to do is from the academic world. And perhaps sometimes we're not we at this we, you see, because we have to be very close to be many of the problems that I have sensed in this field is, especially when I was working in Krefeld as a chief of evaluation and research, was how to get involved with the community without knowing the community for a long time and related with the community. So this is part of that, and that happens in the school. We have 6 months to be involved with the lives of students. So in making research at the classroom, is another challenge. And just a short remark about the possibilities that we have for exercises we're reading in research, like exercising the citizenship in reading, or making efforts in living together with the sense of community, which is how reading can help to research and to act in a community.
Stig?
Yes, yep.
Well, I think also it all depends on what you are searching for knowledge. What are you what are your aims with the research? Because you can observe, and you can observe in different ways. So I've done a lot of research with the video cameras in classrooms. And also a research project with a colleague of mine. They have been researching how students are doing learning when they are talking with each other or with their families. So they have got their own video tape recorders or camera to have in the car when they are driving, or to have the camera in front of the table when they are eating, having dinner. And then the researcher can take that camera back. No researcher in the room or in the car. It's just the video camera. So you can see how things are done in interaction without the researchers participating. Another way around is to, if you want to have the perspectives of the learners or the readers, then I think you must talk to them. They must share their experiences. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get behind. So, and then of course there's many ways of doing that, of course. So I think I agree with Mike also, that you must be and try to be innovative in educational research as well, to try different things. And so many is also just using interviews as a way to conduct research, but that I think, for the first one thing, it's easy to interview people, but it isn't, and it's a hard work, and you must prepare for it to get access to people's lives and be able to get them to talk and stuff like that. So yeah, just a short note about this. It all depends what you're looking for kind of knowledge.
Okay. Thank you very much. Coco, you are ready? We can hear you, Coco. We can't.
Yes.
You can? Okay.
No escuchamos.
Está en el canal de inglés. Sí.
Esa fue una larga pregunta.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, she finished to translate.
Stig-Börje, do you want to comment first? I can, but
Oh, please go ahead, Mike. I think with
yeah, okay. Yeah, flexible identities. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I was also wondering, like back a little while ago when we were talking about masculinity, to what extent kids in Mexico or in your part of Mexico, or what you're seeing as teacher educators or whatever it is you do, in terms of is gender identity becoming more flexible? Because it certainly is in my context in North America. So kids' identities are extremely flexible, right down to the level of basic boy-girl, you know, the traditional sense of that. What I found working with teachers as well in teacher education over the last 20 years, there is absolutely no gender prejudice that I've been able to see in my teacher ed candidates. Gay, straight, lesbian, transgendered, nobody gives a shit anymore. Gender is off the table as a they've got all kinds of weird racial attitudes. They've got all kinds of weird social class attitudes, but gender, they seem pretty cool with the range of gender presentation out there. So that's one but the other one where you talk about parental reluctance in rural areas to engage technology. I've actually written a book about that. If you're interested, I'd be very happy to send it to you. It's a Routledge book. I think these academic publishing companies are a racket. I'm happy to give it to you. If you buy it, it'll cost you $300, which is ridiculous. But that's one of the things that we looked at. The way that rural parents were reluctant to see their kids engage with technology. We were doing a project with filmmaking in a middle school in a rural community. And many of the parents had this idea that reading is textbooks, and textbooks contain safe curricular, so they're age appropriate, first of all. They're not going to get anything that's too old or too young for them. The experts have defined this as age appropriate knowledge. It's also truthful knowledge that contains the real goods, the real knowledge goods about chemistry or biology or English language arts for that age group. So the textbook itself was considered, we called it hard copy text, as opposed to soft copy text, which was anything that was internet based. And we ended up writing about how literacy was a safety. This form of literacy distinction was for parents a way to keep children safe. I guess, again, I'm on about that. I'm very interested in schools and curriculum and literacy as a mechanism for safeguarding children.
I will make a short comment, but this will be a story about technology in classrooms, because it's not always parents that don't want their kids to use digital devices and stuff like that. It's also teachers, because
That's right.
We were filming a class, and as it happened, there was a reading project launched in the classroom. The students were to read 20 minutes a day, a class of all boys. And so all the boys took up their books, and we have different cameras in the classroom, because we're interested in how they use their mobile phones as well as in the literacy practices. Everyone took their books out and started to read. And now we have cameras behind them also, and we can see that every one of them took up their mobile phones and read something else than the novels. They were watching movies, they were reading papers on the digital devices. And as soon as the teacher saw that, after maybe 10 to 15 minutes, he went down and they put back the mobile phones, As soon as he went back, the mobile phone was back behind the book. So this is in a context where reading should be like the normal. You should read a novel, a thick book, and not allowed to read on other devices such as the mobile phones or the computers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rita has a question in the chat. I don't know if Rita wants to speak. Well, I think no. In Mexico, our reading outcomes of a standardized test in rural zones are better than urban zones. The rural students have less distractors. However, masculinities are patriarchal yet. How could we reverse this phenomenon? What recommendations do you have?
Ooh. I'm not sure we can reverse these phenomena. I think maybe address is a better way to think about it. What to do about it? Well, I think first of all, understanding literacy apart from or beyond the literacy that gets measured in the standardized test is an important thing. And I think in terms of education policy, I guess one of the things that I've worked on in my part of Canada is to try to encourage the development of literacy assessment tools that are richer and more complex and do, in fact, help young people show what they know rather than be evaluated in terms of what they don't know. We were somewhat successful. Probably 25 years ago, we had a provincial literacy assessment in my part of Canada where students were given a writing task that it took 2 weeks to do. It was a process writing assessment. And the students spent 2 weeks developing a piece of writing, editing it, speaking with one another, collaborating, and then producing a final draft. That assessment got kicked out because it was too expensive and too difficult to score. But it was actually a much better gauge of what those children could do as writers and as readers. I think another part of the problem with it was not only very expensive to administer and to score, but that it pushed teachers to be better teachers. When they saw an assessment that was going to actually force them to do good quality writing instruction, they became more interested in learning how to do good quality writing instruction. So the assessment was actually pushing practice in what I thought was a positive direction. I think the kind of assessments that we have today, which are very simplistic, bubble sheet, paper and pencil, right, wrong, multiple choice, those kinds of assessments, they cause teachers to, I think they encourage, I won't say cause, they encourage teachers to adopt practices that are probably not the best supports for literacy, and they become sort of bubble sheet right and wrong answer teachers, as opposed to teachers that help people engage in rich literacy practices.
Okay. Stig, you?
Well, I think what we talked about today actually also sums it up a bit. I think also that maybe we have focused too much on the ability to read in education, and there has also been with these PISA results, and it also has caused a lot of focus on how to teach reading strategies and stuff like that in the classrooms. These are, of course, very important, but you must also, like, as Mike talked about earlier, talk about in the classrooms why we read. why do we read texts and what are the benefits, and to make these students, these rural male students, also be aware of themselves as readers, and also that they are in many cases quite competent readers about quite difficult texts as well. So just to make them aware of this could be one way to address this as well. Maybe not to turn it around, but to start talking about reading is also as important as the how to read, I think. And it's all this connects to motivation and stuff like that, and also the pleasure to read, that it can be fun, but it can also be useful at the same time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question and some comments, but the last question will be that what are the lines that separate rural literacies from eco-literacies, and which do they do with critical pedagogy, critical literacies?
For me, the lines probably don't exist. You know, I see rural literacy as a form of ecological literacy. I agree with Kim Donauer and the people who wrote that book in 2007, that, you know, reading the world in a rural space is also about stewardship. It's about land care. It's about sustainability. It's about how to manage an economy, a rural economy, and to provide the people in it a sense of how they can protect that economy, take care of it, take care of the physical space around them, the ecology, the animals, the water, the earth. And so to me, that is very much a part of what we do if we're operating a good literacy program in a rural community, school, university level, whatever. It should, I think, be very much connected to you know, getting kids outdoors and seeing, doing things in the world. So it's not just some kind of an abstraction, just like we're reading those classic books, you know, sitting passively and absorbing information. It's about thinking about how to make something happen in the world. I like apps. Do you know iNaturalist, for example? This is an app that you can use to you go out with the app and you can point it at a plant, and you will get all kinds of information about that plant. It will identify it, and if you know that the identification is incorrect, you can add information to it, of course. You know, that's actually a form of rural literacy that I see as particularly important. So it connects to outdoor education for me, and also confronting the stereotypes. Yeah, I think is a very important part of it as well. I don't know if that's answering the question. We've been here 2 hours. I may be getting a little bit garbled.
I think this was a great answer, Michael. So I think I will leave it up to you to sum up this with this beautiful answer. So I have nothing to add, just to agree with what Mike said here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So Blanca says that the importance of our interventions to involve more literacy in all environments from different angles is clear to her. So she works with vulnerable areas. The things that you share to us is very useful to her. She said, thank you very much for your interesting talk. Patty Cisneros, she says that Maria Caso, a Spanish pedagogue, used the lyrics from reggaeton or bachata songs to brings these songs to the classroom, and they all analyze them together, the characters and discover the bad things, the horrors they say about women. So it's not avoiding that music that one managed to question, but by taking the music or these things to the classroom. And she also says that if Dr. Michael says about the involvement of art in this methodology, she's very interested, but she will extend the talk. If you want, it's possible. But if you can, she wants to communicate with you, Michael, or if you have a test writing about literacy and art.
Yeah, I do, certainly. I'm happy to respond. So do you have can my email be circulated? Can our emails, is that all right, Stig-Börje, to the group?
Yeah, it's okay, for sure.
Please, the organizer can circulate, and I'm happy always to engage.
Okay, so I think that this will be, Rita says, thank you very much for your response. And yes, I'm going to give the people your email. So I think that it's all for today. So I would like to thank you very much for the talk and your generosity to be here with us so much time, because as I said at the beginning, many of you maybe wasn't here, but Michael is going to retire, so it's we make the possible to be here, that he is in this talk with us, and we are very glad that you accepted and that we heard you, because it was really, really interesting. And so thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Stig. And we would like to thank Stig too, because he's very late now, right now in Sweden. So thank you very much for being with us. And Dr. Patty Rosas apologize because she has to go to another reunion. So she thanks very much too. I don't know if somebody has a comment or something.
Just say thank you and great and I don't know if I'm listening right, but Michael be retired, so good for you. You can enjoy the beautiful Canada. So thank you so much for this keynote, and Stig, thank you, and we keep in touch for some probably new researches. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Stig.
Thanks a lot for sharing. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for everybody for being with us. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mayra. Bye-bye. Bye-bye a todos.
Bye.
I know.